From a barren rock to a titan of global finance. From a sparse fishing village to one of the most densely populated and wealthiest territories on Earth. The story of Hong Kong is a story of almost impossible transformation. How did this happen? How did a small island, with no natural resources to speak of, become a symbol of staggering prosperity? The common answer, the one repeated for decades by economists and politicians, is a simple, elegant idea: laissez-faire. The belief that the government of Hong Kong simply stood back, kept its hands off, and allowed the free market to work its magic. But that is only a fraction of the truth. The real story is more complex, more deliberate, and far more fascinating. The prosperity of Hong Kong was not an accident of neglect. It was the result of a unique and calculated strategy, a system that has been called contrived laissez-faire. This is the story of how the specific policies, institutions, and strategic interventions of British colonial rule laid the very foundations for the immense wealth of Hong Kong, creating an economic powerhouse so successful that its core principles were preserved as an invaluable asset, even after the flag of the United Kingdom was lowered for the last time. The genesis of modern Hong Kong is found not in a grand vision for a city, but in a grand problem of trade. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, the British Empire had an insatiable appetite for Chinese goods. Tea, silk, porcelain, these treasures flowed from China to Britain in vast quantities. The problem was that the flow of goods was almost entirely one way. China, largely self-sufficient, had little interest in the products of Britain. This created a severe trade imbalance, a massive deficit that was draining silver from the coffers of the British state. The British solution was as cynical as it was effective: opium. Cultivated in the colonies of Britain in India, the drug was smuggled into Chinese ports, addicting a nation and finally reversing the flow of silver. This illicit trade, combined with deep British frustration over the restrictive Canton system, which confined all foreign commerce to a small group of designated merchants in Guangzhou, created an explosive situation. The result was conflict. The result was the First Opium War. The war ended with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. For China, it was the beginning of what would be called the Century of Humiliation. For Britain, it was a strategic victory. The treaty opened 5 Chinese ports to the trade of Britain, but most importantly, it delivered the prize that Britain had sought: a permanent base on the Chinese coast. Hong Kong Island was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. What was acquired was not a bustling city, but a rocky, sparsely populated island. In 1841, the territory was home to a mere 7,500 Chinese inhabitants and a handful of foreigners. The initial vision from Britain was simple and pragmatic. The aim was to have a place to careen and refit their ships and keep stores for that purpose. It was to be a strategic harbor, a secure foothold for the traders of the empire. Yet, the seeds of something greater were planted. By 1859, a clear sign of rapid commercial activity and migration was evident, as the Chinese population had surged to over 85,000. Something was already happening. The foundations of an economic miracle were being laid, brick by deliberate brick. The first, and perhaps most crucial, of these foundations was the decision made at the very beginning. In 1841, Hong Kong was declared a free port. This was not a gradual evolution, it was a foundational decree. It meant that goods could flow in and out of the territory with almost no friction. There would be no tariffs, no customs fees, no value-added tax, and no goods and services tax. The required documentation was minimal, and licensing requirements were few. For global merchants, this was a revolutionary environment. While the Treaty of Nanking had opened other treaty ports in China, none of them enjoyed this level of absolute economic freedom. They still operated under a web of Chinese regulations. Hong Kong, as ceded territory, was different. It became an instant magnet for international trade, completely bypassing the old, restrictive Canton system. This unilateral openness, established from day one of the rule of Britain, gave it an unparalleled competitive advantage. This policy fostered a deep-seated adaptability within the economy. When Hong Kong lost preferential access to the market of the United Kingdom after Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973, the economy did not crumble. It simply pivoted. The entrepreneurs of Hong Kong found new customers, and the United States soon became the main market, growing to a scale over 3 times larger than the market in Britain by the early 1970s. The success was not built on imperial favoritism, but on a robust and flexible open model. The second pillar of this economic architecture was a tax system of radical simplicity. The government of Hong Kong adopted a territorial principle. Tax was only levied on profits generated from activities inside Hong Kong. Profits that were earned entirely from activities outside the territory were generally exempt. The rates themselves were astonishingly low. Corporations benefited from a 2-tiered profits tax rate, with just 8.25% on the first 2 million Hong Kong dollars of profit, and 16.5% on amounts above that threshold. Unincorporated businesses enjoyed similarly low rates of 7.5% and 15% respectively. What was just as important as the low rates was what was missing from the tax code. There was no sales tax. There was no capital gains tax. There was no withholding tax on dividends or interest. There was no estate tax. This streamlined, minimal tax burden made the territory an exceptionally attractive hub for investment, for international transactions, and for the management of wealth. But this raises a critical question. If the government was not collecting high taxes, how did it pay for anything? How did it build a city? The answer lies in the most contrived element of the entire economic system: land. The government, as the ultimate owner of all land, did not sell it outright. It sold leases on fixed terms. By strategically restricting the sale of new land leases, the colonial administration was able to maintain land prices at what some considered artificially high levels. The revenue generated from these massive land sales became a primary source of public finance. It was an ingenious solution. It allowed the government to fund its operations, build infrastructure, and accumulate enormous fiscal reserves, all without imposing the high income or profit taxes that could stifle business. This unique model was not simply a top-down British imposition. When the colonial government attempted to introduce a more conventional income tax in 1939, and again after the Second World War, it was met with fierce resistance, particularly from the Chinese business community. The result was a compromise: a schedular tax system introduced in 1940 that taxed different income types separately, with an initial highest rate of just 10%, a level that effectively exempted 99% of the population. This low tax regime, born from local pressure and colonial pragmatism, gave the government of Hong Kong a high degree of financial independence from London, allowing it to chart its own fiscal course and resist calls for higher social spending. The third pillar, and the bedrock upon which the others stood, was the rule of law. The British brought with them their common law system. This was more than a legal formality, it was a profound economic enabler. Unlike civil law systems based on rigid statutory codes, common law relies on precedent and judicial interpretation. For international business, this offers a high degree of predictability and flexibility. Contracts are interpreted according to well-established principles, and the reliance on precedent allows parties to foresee the outcome of legal disputes with a high level of certainty. This predictability is crucial for long-term investment. Freedom of contract was paramount. Property rights were clear and secure. Both movable and immovable properties could be bought and sold by anyone, without restrictions based on nationality. This legal certainty created a trusted, transparent framework that dramatically reduced the risks associated with investment. Capital from around the world flowed into Hong Kong, confident that it would be protected by a reliable and impartial legal system. This system proved so effective and so foundational to the prosperity of the territory that it was enshrined in Article 8 of the Basic Law after the 1997 handover, making Hong Kong the only jurisdiction in China to practice common law today. With these foundations in place, the physical construction of the economic machine could begin. The natural deep-water harbor was a gift of geography, but the mountainous terrain was a severe constraint. To build a city, the British had to build the land itself. From the 1840s onwards, a continuous and ambitious program of land reclamation began. The sea was pushed back, creating new ground for docks, for warehouses, for offices, and for homes. This was the physical manifestation of the land-based fiscal policy: create new land, sell the leases, and use the revenue to fund further development in a virtuous cycle of growth. The evolution of the port itself tells a story of strategic foresight. In the 1960s, a global revolution in cargo handling was underway: the container. A government committee issued a stark warning. If Hong Kong failed to build a modern container port, its economy would suffer. It would be bypassed in favor of rivals like Singapore and Japan. The government heeded the warning. The Kwai Chung container port began operations in 1972. It was a spectacular success. By the late 1980s, Hong Kong had overtaken the port of New York and New Jersey, and then Rotterdam, to become the busiest container port in the world. This proactive approach extended to other critical infrastructure. The government faced a constant struggle to provide a stable water supply for its booming population. A crisis in 1963 led to severe rationing, with water available only once every 4 days for a 4-hour period. This directly threatened industrial production and social stability. The response was twofold: massive investment in local water schemes, such as the Tai Lam Chung and Shek Pik reservoirs, and crucially, a landmark agreement with mainland China. The Dong Shen project, which began formally supplying water from Guangdong province in 1965, secured the very lifeblood of the city, eventually covering 70 to 80% of the annual freshwater needs and underwriting future growth. A city is more than concrete and steel. The greatest asset is its people. And in the mid-20th century, Hong Kong received an injection of human capital that would ignite its industrial revolution. Following the Civil War on the Chinese mainland after 1945, a massive wave of humanity flowed into the relative safety and stability of the British colony. They came in two distinct streams. First were the entrepreneurs, particularly from Shanghai. They brought with them not only capital but also critical skills and industrial expertise. They established the cotton spinning industry in the colony, building the first modern factories. Second were the hundreds of thousands of Cantonese refugees. They provided a vast, adaptable, and affordable pool of labor, instrumental for the transformation of Hong Kong into an export-oriented industrial economy. This sudden demographic dividend was the catalyst. A humanitarian crisis on the mainland was inadvertently transformed into a profound economic advantage for Hong Kong. This human engine was further refined by an education system influenced by Britain. The founding of the University of Hong Kong in 1912 was a key milestone. Over time, access to higher education, technical training, and English instruction expanded, creating an increasingly skilled and flexible workforce, one capable of powering a sophisticated modern economy. This fostered a unique entrepreneurial culture. The industrial landscape was not dominated by a few large corporations. By 1975, an impressive 96.5% of manufacturing businesses employed fewer than 100 workers. This ecosystem of small, nimble enterprises created a culture of incredible resilience and adaptability. This adaptability would be tested again and again. The first great pivot came in the 1950s. International embargoes on China, a consequence of the Korean War, meant that Hong Kong could no longer function primarily as an entrepot for Chinese trade. The traditional economic role of the city was severed. Faced with potential ruin, the economy transformed. Fueled by the new influx of entrepreneurs and labor, Hong Kong became an export-oriented manufacturing powerhouse. The label, "Made in Hong Kong," once a byword for cheap trinkets, evolved to represent high-quality textiles, garments, plastics, and electronics. The second great pivot was triggered in 1978, when China began its historic process of opening up to the world. The firms of Hong Kong, with their capital and expertise, were perfectly positioned. They began to move their labor-intensive factories across the border, taking advantage of the vast and cheaper labor pool on the mainland. But as manufacturing moved out, a new industry surged. Hong Kong re-embraced its role as the gateway to China, but this time, not just for goods, but for capital. It became the premier financial and commercial services hub for a modernizing China. This massive structural shift from a manufacturing economy to a service economy was accomplished with breathtaking speed and smoothness, all while maintaining an average unemployment rate of only 2.5% from 1982 to 1997. Through all this change, one thing needed to remain constant: confidence. In 1983, as negotiations over the future of Hong Kong intensified, a crisis of confidence gripped the territory. The value of the Hong Kong dollar plummeted. In a decisive act of intervention, the government established the linked exchange rate system, pegging the currency to the United States dollar at a rate of 7.8 to 1. This currency board provided a rock-solid monetary anchor, proving resilient through major regional and global crises. It ensured stability through decades of political uncertainty and survived the Asian financial crisis of 1997 and the global financial crisis of 2008. It was a clear signal to the world that Hong Kong was, and would remain, a stable and reliable place to do business. The culmination of this long, complex history arrived on July 1, 1997. The rule of Britain ended, and sovereignty was transferred to the People's Republic of China. But the economic system that had been built over 156 years did not vanish. It was preserved under the framework of one country, two systems. This was the ultimate validation of the model built by the British. The separate economic characteristics of Hong Kong were deemed so beneficial, so valuable to the economy of China itself, that they were protected by law. The free port, the common law, the stable currency, the low-tax environment, these were not colonial relics to be discarded, but strategic assets to be maintained. The story of how Hong Kong became rich is not a simple fable of non-intervention. It is the story of a contrived system, a pragmatic blend of British institutions and Chinese entrepreneurial spirit. It was a system built on the unilateral freedom of a global port, funded by the calculated scarcity of land, and protected by the unwavering certainty of the law. It was a system that demonstrated a profound capacity to absorb human talent and to adapt to seismic geopolitical shifts, turning every challenge into a new opportunity for growth. The enduring legacy of British rule is etched into the very DNA of this extraordinary city, a unique and resilient framework that forged a barren rock into one of the great economic wonders of the modern world.